artists covered two different types of paintings, one being Romanticism and the other was Realism. I will be covering the Romantic era rather than the more rational realistic paintings. Romanticism was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century, all the way to the start of the 1900s, and was sort of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, which eventually spread into France and America. There were many artists during this time period, but one of the more noticeable ones might be Eugène Delacroix from the years 1798 to 1863. He had published many famous paintings, such as The Liberty Leading the People in 1830 or The Death of Sardanapalus in 1827. In the painting The Massacre at Chios in 1824, we can notice that Delacroix always had an interesting approach to lighting and perspective of the art. Another great artist goes by the name of John Constable, born in Suffolk in 1776, was an English Romantic painter. He is known principally for his landscape paintings of Dedham Vale, the area surrounding his home, now known as Constable Country. "I should paint my own places best," he wrote to his friend John Fisher in 1821. "Painting is but another word for feeling." This said a lot about the Romantic era. Art during the Renaissance was more of a cultural movement, but during the post-Renaissance era, specifically during the period of Romanticism, art was a way of expressing emotion rather than culture. The Romantic era used emotion as its main component, or rather convention. Artists couldn't help but stress strong emotion, imagination, and freedom as a rebellion against the social conventions. During the Dark Ages, which took place during the Renaissance from 14th to 17th century, artists focused on culture, but once the post-era of Renaissance hit, art became a way of expressing one's emotion. Romanticism was a philosophical movement during the so-called Age of Enlightenment, which emphasized emotional self-awareness as a necessary precondition to improving society and humans as a whole. Romanticism began because there was a shift in the philosophy. Artists didn't want to follow the order of things. They were against precise rules, laws, and formulas that characterized classicism. This era praised imagination over reason, emotion over logic, and intuition over science. The Industrial Revolution definitely had an impact on the making of the modern world. Romantic art is meant to be aesthetically pleasing, but artists used abstract as a style of art to really touch the viewer's emotions. Artists focused on contrast, balance, unity, and they experimented with color and neglected proper use of perspective. Famous artists such as Delacroix also loved to use oil on canvas. This period really changed the whole perspective of art. It used to be in an orderly fashion, meaning there were rules that had to be met while painting, but Romanticism really broke through the gates in which it was imprisoned. It touched upon imagination, where one can do anything. It revealed creativity and really let artists express themselves. To really understand Romanticism and its philosophy, let's take a look at the following painting. Friedrich, a German artist, executes a unique composition and employs his famous technique known as the Rückenfugen technique, in which he paints the figure with his back towards the viewer. In Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, the author's use of color and lighting is also noticeable. Some believe Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog to be a self-portrait of Friedrich. The young figure, standing in contemplation, has the same fiery red hair as the artist himself. The figure stands in contemplation and self-reflection, mesmerized by the haze of the sea fog as if it were a spiritual experience. He wonders in that moment about the future. By placing his back towards the viewer, he is not shutting them out, rather he enables them to see the world through his own eyes, to share and really convey his personal experience. Now let's take a look at a sculpture, specifically The Kiss by Rodin, a French artist. Rodin chose to construct the lovers in the nude as he believed strongly that adding details such as clothing distracted the viewer from the raw emotion which they should feel when looking upon the sculpture. The sculpture was made entirely in marble in 1889. The way in which Rodin has intertwined the lovers gives his composition movement and energy.
Realism took place during the mid-19th century, as many artists started to move away from Romanticism and entered the realm of realism. The idea of realism is to represent objects in a truthful manner, to portray them how they actually appear in real life. Artists will not use the general artistic conventions, and will also avoid using any supernatural elements. The art in this time period was very representational, and often included images of living organisms, such as humans or animals. There were many artistic movements during this time, notably the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, also known as the PRB. The Pre-Raphaelites was a movement of both art and literature that started around the year 1850. It consisted of a group of avant-garde painters who practiced realistic art. The movement heavily encouraged realistic depictions of any object, even those that would normally be blurred. Some of the artists involved in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood are James Collinson, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. However, many other artists at the time associated their works with those of the Brotherhood because they followed similar guidelines and often used the same ideology. The goal of this artistic movement was to reform art by rejecting the earlier methods used by famous artists such as Raphael and Michelangelo. The group focused on creating complex compositions that contained intense colors and an abundance of little details, all adding to the aesthetic appeal of the works of art. Many works produced by these artists were often taken from nature or from the world around them. Everything was represented in the works of art as they appeared in real life. Remember, it was all about the precision. Famous artists such as Jean-François Millet produced many works of art following the same guidelines set by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Some of his works include The Angelus, The Sower, Gleaners, and Dandelions. So as you can see, all these works are very similar, in the sense that they all contain realistic depictions of natural things. Whether it is representing scenes of nature or humans doing their everyday activities, it is painted very precisely to keep the same proportions as those in real life. From these paintings, another artist of the time period is Edouard Manet. He is a French artist, and he was amongst the first 19th century artists to paint modern life. As well as he was a crucial stepping stone to make the transition from realism to impressionism. His works include Luncheon on the Grass, Olympia, and The Spanish Singer. If we take a look at The Spanish Singer, for example, we can see that the man has very realistic proportions. His arms and legs are of real size. The size of the guitar in relation to the body is just right. Also, the details on the painting, such as the shadow on his right foot, the used cigarette on the floor, as well as the strap of the guitar, all give more emphasis to how real the painting is, and truly, they are exceptional. Another thing to note is the expression on the man's face, which makes it seem as if he is really singing in front of us. That was the goal of realism, to transform common day-to-day activities. As you may already know, before realism came Romanticism. Romanticism was based on the artist's emotions, and often influenced the creation of paintings that did not represent real life. However, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood wanted to move away from this ideology and influence artists around the world to start creating realistic art that actually resembles real life. This favors detail-oriented works, containing items that share the same proportions as they would in reality. Now, another key event that may have triggered the movement into realism was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. His theory impacted the world of art and literature, as well as the industrial world, because it suggested that we look at the world from a realistic perspective. Now, unlike Romanticism, which focuses primarily on emotions, realism influences artists to base their art on the real world, using as much detail as necessary to make the piece of art look as realistic as possible. However, realism was also a movement in literature. Authors started using real-life characters and composing stories that made us reflect on the real world, rather than using imaginary characters in a world of myths that did not resemble reality at all. Now, as a whole, realism was a worldwide movement that emphasized critical thinking and detail, to depict and look at things as they would appear in real life. Let's take a look at this painting called The Young Ladies of the Village. It was created by Gustave Courbet in 1852. You may have noticed a common trend with these realism paintings. They all seem to depict humans or animals. This one is no different, and in addition, it contains a beautiful scene of nature in the background. The focal point of this painting is in between the little girl and the woman with her hand outstretched. The artist leads you to this spot in the painting by making the other two women stare at the same spot with curiosity. Again, if we look at the proportions of the animals and the humans, we can all see that they are very precise and represent reality. This as well seems to be a common trend with these realistic paintings. As for the background, the artist used several shades of green and mixes in other colors to make the scenery look as realistic as possible. The use of complementary colors is also shown with this painting. If we take a look at the little girl on the left, her blue dress complements the orange material in her hands. Let's take a look at this sculpture from the era of realism. This magnificent work of art was created by Jean-Joseph Perrault, a French sculptor from the 19th century. It is called Despair, and it shows a curled up man with his head down and a serious expression on his face. His fingers are crossed, and it seems as if he is in deep thought and regret. The body of the man is very restricted, and he's taking up little space. This is of course adding to the overall theme of the sculpture, which is despair. Another important thing to look at when analyzing a work of art during this time period is the proportions used and their relation to real life. In this case, the artist created this man with very realistic proportions. His limbs and body are to scale, and his fingers and toes are very precisely executed. Something to note is the very small pedestal used for this work. Imagine if this sculpture was built on a tall pedestal so that we would be looking up at it. So obviously this wouldn't work because it would contradict the message that the artist is trying to convey. You would be looking up at a man filled with regret who is trying to take up as little space as possible in order to not be noticed, so looking up at him just wouldn't make sense. This is why the artist chose to keep him on a lower pedestal and crouch down so he can appear very weak. Photography as a medium of art was discovered in the early 19th century. However, they used a different method to capture images at the time. Today, we use what is called digital photography, which is basically an electronic way to capture images focused by a lens. Nowadays, almost anything can take pictures, and is not a very demanding task at all. However, this was not always the case. At the start, artists would use a camera obscura to capture images. A camera obscura is a box with a hole on one side. Light will pass through the hole and can be projected on a paper or other textile within the box. It can then be traced to create a very accurate representation. To get a sharper image, you can always use a smaller hole. However, as a downside, it will cause the image to be a lot dimmer, so it is important to find a balance. The earliest form of photography is called chemical photography. The name speaks for itself really. This medium requires the use of chemicals in order to capture an image. Silver was a very common base used in combination with chlorine or nitrogen to project the image onto a surface within the camera obscura. Artists used a thin coating of bitumen as a light-sensitive substance. The idea was that after the bitumen hardens, it can be removed and will reveal a positive image, where the light regions are represented with hardened bitumen and the dark regions with just bare pewter. This technique was invented in Nicéphore Niepce in 1820. However, the use of bitumen had its downside. It took several hours, even days, to harden. This makes it very inefficient to create multiple photographs in a short period of time. After Niepce's death in 1833, they discovered that the use of mercury fumes can bring the waiting time down to only a few minutes. With this crucial discovery, this technique can finally be used effectively. In 1847, Count Sergei Lvovich Levetsky designed a camera that improved the process of focusing. His design was found in many cameras for several decades and can even be found today in some professional cameras. During the 1860s, the use of color was starting to be implemented within photographs. They used color filters to transform a standard black and white image into a stunning multicolored photograph. The use of color in this industry was only commercially introduced in 1907. It was called an autochrome plate. This was the most popular technique to implement color in a photograph. With time, innovation, and some creativity, we have perfected this medium, and we can now take large, full-colored pictures with a single click of a button. Art that used to take several weeks to produce can now be done in a matter of seconds.
During the Edo period, the arts were all based off the concept of the floating world. The concept of the floating world is to show the occurrences of everyday life and to express newfound wealth. During the Qing dynasty, art was deemed to be serene, which means it was calm, peaceful, and seemed to be undisturbed. The art was meditative, meaning that the purpose of the art was to create using spiritual powers. The arts done during the Edo period and the Qing dynasty were preceded by the arts of the Romans. There was a significant difference between the two art periods. The Edo arts and the arts of the Qing dynasty were mainly focused on serene, meditative arts and arts of the floating world, and the Romans were focused towards Roman realism, practical, and more down-to-earth type of arts. Around the time of the Qing dynasty, the belief was that art had to be a colorful, figurative style, but that later changed as the concept of art was beginning to emphasize the distinction between art and nature. Dong Kai-chang, a famous theorist during the Qing period, once said, "If one considers the wonders of nature, then painting cannot rival landscape, but if one considers the wonders of brushwork, then landscape cannot equal painting." In this quote, Dong is stating his opinion on the importance of relation between art and nature. The change was influenced by Wang Shimen, a painter who built his career off the advice of Dong. During the Edo period, the influence of the Tokugawa shoguns brought upon Japan had a significant impact on the culture and the arts of the nation. The isolation the shoguns brought upon the population led to artists evolving their skills and producing beautiful artworks. If it were not for the shoguns, the beautiful art we see today created by the Japanese may not be as good as they are now. The Edo period lasted around 260 years, from 1603 to 1868. It marked the time period where Japan saw major changes socially, economically, culturally, and in art. The years following the Edo period saw wars between various political and religious factions for rights over the country. The wars came to a halt when Japanese great generals Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi put an end to all the misery. In the Edo period, development throughout Japan was growing. Trading and its infrastructure of roads were few of many elements that aided the wealth of the nation. The isolation in which the Tokugawa shoguns brought upon the Japanese caused for their culture to expand. The middle-class population had more opportunities to do things, like theater, art, and literature. The Hirosaki Castle is one of many popular and beautiful establishments in Japan. Built in 1810, the Hirosaki Castle is a 3-story building located in Hirosaki Park. The building was originally 5 stories high, but was burnt down in 1637, and only rebuilt hundreds of years later. Just like how the Edo period is the time that brought Japan together and helped flourish its culture and had such a beautiful effect on the country, the Hirosaki Castle is much like that, as it is surrounded by many beautiful plants and wildlife that can be breathtaking. The Qing dynasty was as powerful as the periods that preceded it, such as the Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming eras. The Qing era shaped China to how it is today, but most importantly, it brought China together. It unified 56 different ethnic groups and helped pass on important Chinese cultural traditions. The Forbidden City is one of the world's most recognized and appreciated creations. It is a place that defines Chinese architecture. It is big, beautiful, and has major cultural backgrounds. The Forbidden City is the world's largest ancient palace, one of the 5 most important places in the world, and has the world's largest collection of ancient wooden structures. Although the Forbidden City was built in 1420, and during the Ming dynasty, it is still a major part of the Qing dynasty as it housed many of its emperors. The Qing rulers changed many aspects of the Forbidden City so that it respects Chinese culture. They changed names on some of the main buildings to emphasize harmony instead of what it had previously said, stating supremacy. In addition, they made the nameplates bilingual. The Forbidden City is an architectural representation of the Qing dynasty due to its emphasis of cultural importance and the impact it has in China. Tsushika Hokusai's The Great Wave of Kanagawa is not just the most famous work of art in Japanese history, but one of the world's most popular works of art. Created in 1830 and only published 2 years later, The Great Wave of Kanagawa was the first painting of the 36 views of Mount Fuji. The 36 views of Mount Fuji consist of 36 paintings, all with a unique view of Japan's highest mountain. The image was created on a woodblock print made using ink and colors on a piece of paper that is 10 by 14 inches. The artwork follows the concept of the floating world, because it is a representation of real life. The reason I chose this painting is that it's so mesmerizing and intriguing to look at, because not only do you see such fine detail in every brushstroke to create such a beautiful piece of art, you can see how Hokusai used every element within the artwork to give you more aspects to look at in the image and appreciate the artwork even more than you already would. If you were to look closely at the painting, right in the middle, and have an open mind to what you are looking at, you can see how Hokusai uses the little water pellets falling from the big wave to make it seem like it's snowing on top of Mount Fuji. This takes incredible amounts of creativity. This painting is a significant piece of Japanese history and will continue to be so for centuries.
Turner dealt carefully with the composition of Norham Castle, Sunrise. He used lighting and used the combination of color to achieve a calming, balanced background to this piece. With his loose signature brushstrokes he developed later in his career, he created a hazy atmosphere. It's the castle. It has quietly disappeared behind the haze, blending into the background. The brown banks on both sides of the canvas lead the eye towards the castle, the focal point. The sun rises in a blur right above the castle, also bringing it attention. The early morning fog blends in with the shining sun. The sun continues to rise, ready to share its beauty with the day. It sends us the message that it's quiet here, and it's also calm. All seems at peace. The effectiveness of lighting in this piece was achieved through Turner's light and loose brushstroke, which was known to be one of his famous techniques. If he had practiced a tighter, more precise stroke, the atmosphere wouldn't have been so hazy. Turner combines both warm and cool colors in Norham Castle, Sunrise. The yellow sun takes presence in the cool sky. Its warm reflection invades upon the blues of the morning fog. The brown on both sides of the canvas and the sun above form a triangle of warmness to balance out and form a more or less cool composition. As this was one of his later paintings, Turner focused almost entirely on the lighting of this piece. He wanted the atmosphere to dominate, to express the feeling he felt from seeing the natural sunrise, without the man-made objects interfering. Despite the haze and fog, the sun rises and reflects over the hidden castle in the back, giving this piece a calm and relaxing sensation.
There were many interesting works of art to choose from during this time period, so it was a very tough task to narrow it down to just one work. My favorite work of art was Jean-François' painting of a horse. At first sight, it doesn't seem like very much is going on in the composition. However, after thorough investigation, I have discovered that this is indeed not the case. There are many factors within this painting that makes it visually appealing and makes it stand out. For example, the focal point, being the horse, is very big and captures your attention almost instantly. Also, it is as if we are looking at the horse from a lower altitude. This makes it so that we are looking up at the horse, thus glorifying it even further. Another aspect of the painting that adds emphasis to the horse is the somewhat blurred background. We can see that there is a person in the background with a few cows eating the grass. However, we cannot see them very clearly, and their size indicates their insignificance. Finally, the reason I like this painting so much is the expression on the horse's face. The artist made the horse look big and intimidating, so it is very intriguing to see his scared expression. Also, you can tell he made a sudden stop by his front two hooves. It's as if they have dug into the ground to be able to come to a sudden stop. Also, the horse's gaze is wandering off into the distance, so the mystery of what he saw that made him stop is a nice addition to the painting, and something that really appealed to me.